Good afternoon and welcome to RRS Virtual. Today we will be discussing Packaging Sustainability's New Paradigm, Perspectives on Plastic Neutrality. I am Melissa Radwan, Director of Marketing for RRS, and I will be your technical host. We have a few housekeeping notes to share. All attendees are muted, but we do invite you to submit your questions using the Q&A button in your navigation bar. Please do not use the chat panel for panelist questions. By submitting them through the Q&A button, we will be able to monitor them for response during the roundtable portion of the webinar or as follow-up after the webinar. We are recording today's session. The recording will be available on RRS's YouTube channel, and a link will be emailed to all registrants. We hope you enjoy today's event and will share the recording with your colleagues. Now I would like to turn things over to your webinar host, RRS Senior Consultant, Marisa Adler.
Thanks, Melissa. Hi, everyone. As Melissa said, my name is Marisa Adler. I am a Senior Consultant with RRS, and I'm very happy to be moderating today's conversation. I am also very excited to present a really terrific panel. So the plan today is to start off with introductions, followed by some context setting from Ann Johnson, Vice President and Principal at RRS. After that, we're going to hear from rePurpose Global, explaining plastics neutrality and plastics credits, followed by perspectives from rePurpose Global's project partners, Waste Ventures India, and Vita Coco. Finally, we're going to move into a roundtable discussion. So don't forget, if you have questions, please enter them into the Q&A panel. Okay, next slide. Great. So today we have Ann Johnson. As mentioned, she is Principal and Vice President at RRS, and she co-leads the Global Corporate Sustainability Service Sector. She has more than 25 years of multidisciplinary experience working with global consumer product brands and manufacturers on connecting the principles of sustainable materials management to practice in product and packaging design and recovery. Through her career, she has worked on international solid waste, recycling, and related policy issues. Most recently, she and the RRS team benchmarked the solid waste and recycling systems of more than 30 countries, primarily across emerging markets, and developed a model to evaluate the social, economic, and environmental impact of removing plastic from the environment. Her previous position included the founder and director of the Sustainable Packaging Coalition and consultant at McDonough Braungart Design Chemistry. Ann is currently on the board of directors for Keep America Beautiful. We also have Svanika Balasubramanian. She is the co-founder and CEO of rePurpose, the world's first plastics credits platform. As a global movement enabling conscious consumers and businesses to go plastic neutral, rePurpose makes the environmental action simple and effective for companies of all sizes by removing and recycling as much ocean-bound plastic waste as they produced while embedding sustainability into their product experience to reach consumers. Hailing from Oman in India, Svanika is a Forbes 30 Under 30 honoree, graduate of the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, and recipient of the 2018 President's Engagement Prize. We also have Sahithi Bhupathiraiu from Waste Ventures India. She is an electronics engineer turned sustainability enthusiast with a master's in sustainability and work experience in renewable energy, waste research, green building certifications, and climate change resiliency programs in America and Africa. She returned to India in 2018 to work with Waste Ventures India, a waste management social enterprise, and is now leading it. Apart from work, she loves to try her hand at gardening and reads voraciously. I would also like to give her a special thank you because she's currently in India and on India time, and it's very late at night for her right now. So Sahithi, thank you for joining us. And our final panelist is Daniella Labat. She's a creative marketing professional known for bringing brands to life through innovative campaigns, partnerships, and activations. She currently leads brand communications and social impact for All Market Inc., AMI, the makers of leading coconut water brand Vita Coco, and new premium aluminum canned water brand Ever and Ever. Daniella plays a crucial role in the development and implementation of AMI's sustainability strategy. Daniella previously held similar roles at Away and Beach House Group. So with those introductions, I'm very excited to hand it over to our first speaker, Ann Johnson from RRS. Ann?
Thanks, Marissa. And thanks everybody for being here today, and especially our speakers. And it's a very appropriate day to be talking about this. So I'm giving context setting for this conversation about plastic credits, and I'm going to be talking about the less sexy part, waste. And I think that as we've focused on ocean plastics, sometimes I think the context of where a lot of our plastics come from gets lost. And the fact of the matter is we've had an emerging global waste crisis for more than 2 decades. And a lot of the plastics that end up in our oceans are in fact the consequence of mismanaged waste. And in 2015, Jenna Jembeck did a really wonderful job of finally starting to put some quantitative numbers around this issue. But the World Bank has also done a study and has shown that by 2050, we anticipate the global waste generation to grow by 70%, and much of that is going to be in developing countries, many of whom have some of the most inadequate solid waste management systems in the world. And this is a big part of what we need to address if we want to ultimately address ocean plastics. At the same time, these really rapidly urbanizing countries are home to many of our largest cities, large populations, and as they undergo development, people consume more, there's more packaging, there's more goods and more services, so there's a lot more to manage. As we've looked into this issue, and there's been a lot of work over the years, the International Solid Waste Association has done a great job of this. We know that one of the really big issues in waste in emerging markets is there's a lot of organics, and that really complicates a lot of our aspirations to recover and recycle plastics. And the World Bank documents that on average about 44% of waste is organics, but in many countries it's 50% or more. And the fact that we don't, that wet-dry segregation of waste is not a common practice means that it's even more difficult to take out those materials that have value and recover them. So there's some very foundational issues around waste management that if we're going to solve ocean plastics, we also need to solve the issue around waste in general. So currently today, the plastics that are principally recycled are PET and other select plastics that have known value, but we have a lot of plastics, films, and multi-laminates that have very low or no value, and there really is not a lot of incentive for those to be collected and recycled. So we're not really going to address this problem until waste is managed properly, populations really understand about the best way to manage waste, and we create more incentive to collect and reclaim these low-value plastics. Can you go to the next slide? So just a quick picture of, as Marissa mentioned, RRS has done a lot of work over the last years sort of benchmarking the solid waste and recycling systems of more than 30 different countries, and many of these are emerging markets. So these are sort of some general trends that we documented. And this is part of what makes, I think, a lot of our aspirations for a circular economy very challenging in some of these markets. That there's, as I mentioned, there are problems with the solid waste management systems that are in place, because often we don't have well-engineered landfills. Dumps are common, open burning is common. We have a transition towards more sanitary landfills, but that's something that takes a lot of investment and a lot of time. So we see a lot of mismanagement. Waste energy is typically not deployed. And we do see recycling infrastructure. But as I said, the organics, there's not a lot of organic segregation. Recycling rates are typically less than 10%. India is actually an exception to that. I think their overall recycling rate is closer to 21, 22%. but we still have significant portions of population that don't have regular or convenient access to trash collection. And this is a critical problem that needs to be addressed. And then we rely heavily on informal workers as a primary means of collection for both trash and recyclables, for sorting them. And this is a very complex system with a lot of middlemen, and there's not a lot of efficiency in that. And I think we might hear more of that from Sahithi. So there's a lot of work on trying to improve this, eliminating dumps and improving infrastructure, but these are things that have kind of a long time frame and long trajectory. So let's go to the next slide. One of the things that is definitely exacerbating some of these challenges is climate change. And it doesn't impact, you know, places equivalently, but clearly there are some regions of the world that have are really vulnerable to rising sea levels, more severe storms. Indonesia is one of those places. And so we're already seeing the consequences of climate change and the ability to mobilize mismanaged waste. And you know, we're referring here to Asia Pacific, but this is also happening in the U.S. around the Great Lakes. We're seeing historic trash and litter from around the Great Lakes being mobilized as the Great Lakes actually see the levels rise. So we can go to the next one. So you've all heard the adage, we manage what we measure, and this can't be more true than, I think, ocean plastics. And Jenna Jambeck putting numbers around things in 2015, and then Roland Geyer wrote a paper on the production, use, and fate of all plastics ever produced in 2017. And this really put a very sharp focus on what has happened to plastic and how much of all plastic that was ever produced, almost 40%, went into packaging, and only a very small amount of that over this history of plastic production has been recovered for recycling. It really highlighted the fact that we're losing huge amounts of material and plastic into landfills or the environment. And so that this, I think, really catalyzed action, finally, even though many people had been talking about it for decades. You'd had the Algalita Foundation and others, you know, monitoring the gyres, but it was when we actually had some numbers, when we had identified some source locations, and we got into strategies for how we could address them, that we really started to see investment funds and real significant engagement with the important stakeholders involved in this. Next slide. So I'll conclude on this, that I think for a systemic solution to ocean plastics, we have to address mismanaged waste. It's not sexy, it doesn't necessarily have a great brand story, but it is really important that we think about that because a lot of our plastics come from that waste, and they have a unique ability to accumulate in the environment, which is why the problem is getting worse and worse. But if we look at the composition of waste, we can see that we can't recycle our way out of this problem because we're only going to be addressing a fraction of the overall waste stream. So that to really, I think, get to the root problem of things, we have to both be dealing with solid waste issues as well as trying to build and drive new recycling capacity. And there are a lot of strategies that are heavily within focus today, working on investments with infrastructure and education. And I think we're going to focus on the issues around incentives and credits, and really how do we make plastic recovery, collection, and reclamation more viable. So I think that with that, I will leave it and turn it over to the next speaker.
Great. Thanks for that foundational setting, Anne. I agree, it's really good to take that sort of holistic view of how plastics fit into the overall waste management construct. And it is one piece of the puzzle, and it is, when it boils down to it, it is a waste management issue. So now we're going to turn it over to rePurpose Global, and we'll hear from Svanika about how companies can mitigate their plastics impact. Svanika?
Yeah, thank you, Marisa. Thank you, Anne. Just, as a quick reintroduction, rePurpose is the world's first plastic credit platform. And today I'd love to talk about how plastic credits can be used as a financing tool when we're thinking about innovation in the waste management space, and when we're thinking about innovating for, today's World Oceans Day, and a lot of the talk about reducing leakage into the oceans and so on. I think we can focus a little bit on what are some ways that we can catalyze these kinds of innovations, these kinds of changes. So, just to give a little bit of background to add on to what Anne said, if we go on to the next slide, one of the biggest puzzles that I think rePurpose we set out to solve was, on the one hand, this insane funding gap that we were seeing across, the developing world when it came to infrastructure that could deal with our waste in an efficient and ethical manner. And one statistic that always, I think, fascinates me is that WeWork as a company, the co-working space, has had more money invested into it than all of recycling in the history of time all over the world combined, which really tells you how underfunded these kinds of sectors are. And exactly as Anne mentioned, sometimes it's not, I think, the most sexually it's not the a sexy kind of topic to be talking about, but it definitely requires, I think, a lot more funding. And so that was one piece of the puzzle where we said there are so many, including Waste Ventures, Sahithi can speak to this in a little bit, but there's so many organizations such as Waste Ventures India across the world that are trying to improve upon the existing infrastructure, trying to remove more plastic from the ecosystem, but just lack the capital to scale. So where do we bring in that capital from? And so that's question number one. And then if we go on to the next slide, that's really question number two, which is on the flip side, we're seeing this amazing awakening among millennial consumers, but really across the board, where consumers are saying and asking brands to do something about their plastic footprint. There's a lot of awareness. I think there are a few surveys that came out that even amidst the coronavirus pandemic, amidst the health concerns and the economic shifts that we're seeing right now, overall people still care about, 67% people care more about plastic today than they did exactly 1 year ago, which really shows this rising trend in people just caring about where their plastic waste is going and what they want to do about it. And for brands, I think, there isn't an easy magic solution where you, flip a switch and all the plastic is removed from your supply chain, from your entire supply chain. It's definitely a journey that they go on, and it might take a few years to really get right. So in the meantime, what is something that they can do that is efficient, that is impactful, but that is also immediate, something that they can do today to tackle their plastic footprint? So that's question number two. And if we go to the next slide, that's really how we put the puzzle together by using this concept of plastic credits and by using, the rePurpose ecosystem. So rePurpose, when we first started, we were the first people to get into the space, but now we've seen, I think, a few other players moving in, which has been fantastic because it's such a nascent space when we talk about plastic credits. So the way the ecosystem in general works is you have an ecosystem enablers such as rePurpose sitting in the middle, and on the one side you have the funders of the ecosystem, the consumers and the businesses who have a plastic footprint and want to do something about it, and Vita Coco is a great example that Daniella will speak to in a bit. And on the other side you have these impact creators who are able to use that funding to go out and create impact in the world, and Waste Ventures is an excellent example of that piece of the ecosystem. And the way it really works when we think about plastic credits is we first measure the plastic footprint of any consumer or any brand, and then they fund the removal of an equivalent amount from our ecosystems by funding the impact creators on the ground. And typically it's about 50 cents a kilogram or 25 cents a pound. So let's say, for ease of math, that a brand had a plastic footprint of 100 pounds. What they would be doing is contributing $25 into the platform that then is fueled to the impact creator that they're paired with, and the impact creator uses that funding to go out into the ecosystem and remove 100 additional pounds of plastic waste, bring it back to their facilities, get it processed, get it recycled, and so on and so forth. And what this is really doing is giving the impact creators that kind of funding to go out and build new infrastructure or kind of tackle low value material streams like MLPs that typically don't get tackled, and really is giving them that space to operate over there. So that's kind of, plastic credits in a nutshell. So if we go on to the next slide, that's, how we, I think, package it. So if you are able to offset 100% of your plastic footprint, then similar to a carbon neutral certification, there is the plastic neutral certification, and every product gets certified as a plastic neutral product. If you offset, more than 200% of your footprint, then you have the plastic negative certification. And then we also have the impact guarantee program, where it's similar to kind of, every product we sell, we plant a tree. This is something similar where you can say for every product we sell, we remove a pound of plastic from our ecosystem, or we remove a kilogram of plastic from our oceans, and so on. So there's different ways to, I think, model and use the plastic credits that are being, I think, generated through the rePurpose ecosystem to make it something that is appealing to consumers as well, so that it's really kind of a win-win for brands and impact creators on both sides. So the next slide, we have kind of a quick overview of the rePurpose community. We've been lucky so far to work with an amazing array of businesses from Asia to Africa to North America, and mostly CPG brands such as Vita Coco, but also Fortune 500 financial services firms, really anybody who's interested in kind of catalyzing this sort of an impact. And on the next slide, on the flip side, our impact community is again spread out across the world through various kinds of projects across 7 different countries and 3 different continents, everything from direct marine recovery of removing plastic directly from the ocean to catalyzing low value waste streams that typically are not profitable to tackle. So I'll just leave you guys with one quick last thought. So the next slide is kind of just where are we going from here? And so, plastic credits is not a standalone kind of concept. And so rePurpose, as I mentioned, when we started it, we were very nascent and it was just us kind of preparing this ecosystem. But in the last year, there's been this amazing boom around the concept. And so there's the 3RI initiative, the 3R initiative by Vera, which was convened by the likes of Nestle and Johnson & Johnson, and has participating members such as the World Wildlife Fund and McKinsey.org that have come together to say, what can we do next to kind of create a standard similar to the verified carbon standard that governs carbon credits? Can we create a standard that governs plastic credits? So that's the plastic accounting standard that's being created that rePurpose is now actually a consultant on. We're helping them write the methodology for this accounting standard that's set to be released later this year. So when that does come out, all kinds of plastic credits will be governed under this, and this will help ensure kind of transparency as well as, accuracy in terms of how the credits are being allocated. But importantly, also when we think about additionality and baselines and really what is the impact that's being created, is there an actual additionality over baseline, and so on. So happy to, maybe in the roundtable portion of it, speak more about kind of the accounting system as well around plastic credits, but I'll just end there.
Great, thank you so much, Svanika. Very thoughtful approach to how we track and mitigate our plastics impact globally. So I'm very excited now to go to Sahithi. She's again with Waste Ventures India, and let's hear about the boots on the ground experience implementing sort of the waste management side of the plastics credits.
So again, I would, I think, like to say hi everyone from India, and to reiterate what Anne and Svanika just said, definitely not a sexy business to be in, which I can vouch for, because 2 years ago when I wanted to come back from Southern California to Hyderabad, where I was born and brought up in, there was so many people who questioned me, okay, are you really going to work on the field in waste management? But that was what, attracted me to Waste Ventures India as well, is that we are hyper local and I can see the impact that we create every single day. So the aerial shot that you see here is the snapshot of one of the waste picker colonies we work with. So Waste Ventures India, to give you a brief introduction, is a social enterprise which works on two fronts. One is with bulk waste generators at the source. We work to solve some of the problems that Anne has mentioned, source segregation issues, and then how we can train them at the source, how we can manage the segregated waste, probably in on-site or probably very in their community instead of transporting it to some other city and then segregating it and doing all that. On the other hand, we also work with a community of around 1,500 plus waste pickers, and we deal with them on various types of waste, but they are our partners. So what we do is we mobilize collection of low value plastics. That's how we and rePurpose are partnered as well. So we feel that the most socioeconomic impact that we can create with the waste pickers is in the low value plastics field. As Anne has said, there is a lot of supply chain already set up for high value plastics, but for low value plastics is what you will see on the litter in the streets, in the oceans, and everywhere in between, right? So that is where those two are where most of our energies go in. So do we have a next slide, Marisa? Oh. So the way we do it is also, we don't believe in formalizing the informal sector because that has been experimented sometimes and it has failed. We also don't believe in charity. We instead believe in kind of enabling them to pull themselves up, right? So what we do is when we purchase low value waste from them, I'll just go a level back and then just clearly explain the process, right? So what happens in India, at least in my community, is that most of the times there's no segregation of dry and wet wastes at home. So the waste picker, they have, each family or each community has a certain number of vehicles that they use to collect trash from door to door, and they're paid a certain user fee, very small, not enough to sustain them, of course. So they take all that mixed waste, and out of the muck, that is the wet waste plus dry waste, they do sort out all the high value plastics and metals and electronic waste and whatever they can sell to the dealers or the recyclers. And the rest they either burn or dump, which was the situation beforehand, right? And as we've heard in the webinar, usually the dumping is not scientific, the dumping is not mandated, and it's not sanitary and all of that. But the good thing is they have a very, very good initiation on what to segregate, how to segregate, and all of that. So the way we have taken advantage of that is we have, number one, promoted source segregation so that the waste pickers do not have to deal with wet waste at all in their line of business, or if they do, they can just directly take it to compost centers. The dry waste that they get segregated into the non-contaminated dry waste now, gets segregated into almost 10 to 20 different categories depending on where they are. So all of the high value plastics, they still find someone to take it, or they can sell it to us as well. But the low value plastics, we collect from them. And what we do with them, and most of the times they are not recyclable. So we are partnered with cement factories who take this laminate waste and use it in place of coal. So it's a win-win situation, right? We're pulling back laminates from the atmosphere, and we're also reducing the usage of non-renewable energy. But the problem in this ecosystem is that no one pays, right? The waste picker does not pay, the cement factory does not pay, even though it's raw material for them. And we incur processing costs, transportation costs, and all of that. That's where EPR came in at one point. But the problem with EPR where brands pay is that it's fantastic, but right now it's not consistent and it's not enough for companies like us to rely on to scale up efficiently, right? I think that's where plastic credits play a very important role. It can effectively enable us to scale up in a consistent way and stay there and then provide that extra socioeconomic impact. So just to give you a context, our waste pickers who partnered with us see a 20% rise in their income once we collect laminate waste from them, which may not sound a lot, but usually these communities are very focused in using that extra 20% towards their child's education or towards their children's health. At least 80% of the people we surveyed gave us that information, right? So there is a direct impact being made. And there is no dearth of legislation on this. So I think where we go from here is just seeing From the private sector, we see galvanizing of plastic credits and something to help up the ecosystem. And from the public, from the government, we see implementation of the legislation that already exists. We have a solid waste management law, at least in India. And I'm sure most countries have proper laws by now. What is lacking is on-ground implementation. We're also, even though it's not directly relevant to plastic, because we also talked about organic waste, we also have been working with the municipalities and the hyperlocal governments to kind of set up composting centers as well, or zero waste units as well. So we have already set up 3 such units where, let's say for every 3,000 families, there's a zero waste unit, which in a land which was previously a landfill, where this sort of segregation and recycling happens, and then the composting happens for organic waste, and whatever reject waste is left, and 10-15% of it is incinerated. So nothing that comes into the zero waste unit goes out, but we have seen that this has been only possible in a hyperlocal way, right? You cannot combine it for a whole city or a country. So next slide. So yeah, that's it from my end. Of course, if you have any questions, we will go into a little more depth in the roundtable. I look forward to meeting all of you and understanding your perspectives further.
Great, thank you so much, Sahithi. And so now for our final intro presentation, we're going to turn to Vita Coco and Daniella, who's one of the brands using the plastics credit system. Daniella?
Hi, everyone. Happy World Oceans Day. Thank you so much to the team for having me join this very informative call. I would probably have to say, I want to start with what multiple of you have mentioned thus far of waste management not being a sexy cause, which is definitely something that I've heard a lot. I mean, I think sustainability from a brand perspective has not traditionally been considered sexy, but I think that is a huge actually shift that's happening for consumer and for brands. And I'd like to believe we can make this super sexy and really fun, because the more we learn and we realize the role that the brand can play, the more fun we can have with it with consumers and really create hopefully some catalysts for change in the mindset of our community, for example. So I'm from Vita Coco, coconut water. I work for All Market Inc., which is the technically parent company, but we're independently owned, and we are still a mighty little team that loves to make a lot of noise and make sure that we're doing the right thing. So when it came to kind of approaching sustainability, you know, traditionally the company has never had like an official policy around it. That's the beauty of being an independently owned company. But we've been really working the last couple of years figuring out what's the right way forward. How do we approach this issue? How do we make sure that we're being thoughtful? How do we work with the right partners to make sure we have the impact that we need to have? Because at the end of the day, as a beverage company, we're single use, you know we are part of the problem. And it's really important to start there, to developing a plan to figure out how we're going to move forward and how can we make sure we're doing the right thing. You know, we're seeing a rise in consumers looking for brands to make sure what type of programs do they have in place. Do they care about the planet? Do they care about people? What is your social impact or CSR? And for us, when it comes to sustainability, it's really kind of tackling that question around being a single-use beverage company, and what can we do to make sure that, you know, we're being thoughtful. And so we like to focus around recovery and what impact we kind of can make in that sector. I think the biggest thing, our biggest takeaway is this is really new for a lot of brands. Like, how do we talk about not just recycling, but where does it go? You know, do we have an opportunity to be educational around it, to give consumers tools that they need to understand that they can take an aluminum can and throw it away in the right bin and it can get recycled properly? Or, you know, do you take a grade 52 Tetra plastic and make sure that it can be recycled in your community? There's all these questions that we ask. And when it comes to plastic waste and specifically, you know, we wanted to find a partner that could have impact on the ground, because our general approach to impact is to make sure that we are being grassroots, that we are being hyper local, that there is impact that works for a community and that can be scalable. And we found all those things when we were looking at working with rePurpose. And you know, just heard from Sahithi at Waste Ventures, it is a very hyper local program, and it's what works best for the community. And I think having community-led programs is what's going to allow us to really test and scale this type of solution and see if it's something that we can expand across the business and then become a leader for within the beverage sector. You know, I think that's something that, as this is so new, people are asking a lot of questions. Like, you know, it's where carbon credits were several years ago before, you know, it became kind of like this standard system for reducing carbon emissions. Plastic credits is really in the beginning phase right now, and understanding who are the right players and who can we partner with to be helpful and not harmful is something that's really key from a brand perspective. It kind of fits into our story, like I mentioned earlier, as part of, you know, understanding where our waste goes. So what we put out in the world, we want to be able to take back. So we're starting with pilot programs with rePurpose, which we're really excited to see kind of what kind of scale that can have. And then the next piece, which we're going to act on probably on the last part of this journey for us, which is going to span over several years, is going to be consumers, because it's really important for us to not just communicate to consumers like, look at what we did, we're so awesome. We want to make sure that consumers understand why we're doing the programs we're doing and the impact they can have and how they can have an impact of choice at their home when they're making purchases. So I think that's, you know, another opportunity there when talking about making waste management or recovery a little bit sexier. Not only do brands have an opportunity for storytelling, but they also have an opportunity for education. And that's something that we're looking at building out further, is how do we better educate our consumers to not only recycle properly, but understand what recycling is available in their city, and how can they help make positive changes for their community, and what that can look like for the overall solution towards, you know, for us specifically focusing on recovery and then plastics that are going into the ocean. So yeah, that's my little spiel.
Great, wonderful. So we're going to move into the roundtable discussion next. And just a reminder for participants, if you have a question, please submit it via the question and answer button, and we will take those as they come in. To start us off, we're going to expand on what Daniella has been saying. And you talked a little bit about what motivated Vita Coco to engage in this. Can you talk a little bit, what advice do you have for other brands who want to be involved?
Well, I think it's really important when it comes to social impact in general, understanding what are the clear priorities for the brand. Is it you want to be focusing on carbon emissions? Do you want to be focusing on recovery? Do you find yourself like putting out a lot of waste, you know? Is it you want to be innovative on packaging design and make sure that we're moving the sector forward when it comes to packaging design? Those are principles that are really important to understand from your business perspective and your brand perspective, because then that can help determine the choices you make and the role that your brand has in the conversation. I think it's really important that brands are not the masterminds behind this. We are the amplification tool for all of the great work that's being done by many different nonprofits and like NGOs across the world. So we want to help propel those messages, but we as a brand have a responsibility to do the research on our end and figure out what our priorities are, where do our values fall, and how do we work with the right people to further amplify that.
Terrific, great. Let's see here. So next question is moving to Sahithi and Waste Ventures. You talked about, you painted a good picture of how the waste management system in India is working, and you talked about how there's legislation. Can you talk a little bit about, you know, how helpful are these plastics credits to the socioeconomic welfare of the informal sector? And maybe what can be done to make them even more effective, to increase that impact?
Okay. So right now, one problem that is very evident to us over the past 3 to 4 years that we've been working exclusively with our brand of waste, because there's a lack of consistency and lack of long-term projects. So the problem also with the waste, because in general is they are more concerned about where their next paycheck is going to come from, right? They're not concerned really about what is going to happen next year. But as an organization that is working with them, we have to be. So if I start with EPR, which is very good, EPR is a wonderful tool for brands to take care of their plastic waste. But it's not long-term, right? Brands associate with us for a year or two, not more than that. or for a specific consistency, right? Where plastic credits come in is the scale, I would say, and the consistency as well. If a project is 2-3 years, and if it tells me, okay, this is what your collection is going to be, let's say Waste Ventures for the plastic credits have to collect 200 tons of waste every month for the next 3 years, that will help me tremendously in consistently supporting my waste pickers. And that impact is consistently like 20 rupees per month for 3 years is much more useful for them than maybe 200 rupees 1 month and then just no show for the next 6 months, right? And also what happens is when there are inconsistencies, the waste pickers also get demotivated and they're like, okay, why should I even segregate this low value plastic? I might just as well just leave it in the muck and let it go to the landfill or burn. So there is also that incentive problem, and there's also that motivating them that a lot of burden of that falls on that, which I think plastic credits will improve by a lot. In fact, that is the one best thing that has come out of our partnership with rePurpose over the last year. We have seen a lot of consistency come in. At least the expectations are set right, and we can communicate with the waste because what our tonnage will look like, what our expectations from them will look like for the next year at least, right? So I think plastic credits, where they come in is they offer a lot of consistency, and they offer some extra funding desperately needed to take out those low value plastics, which are the greatest harm to the environment, right? Because if you don't fund PET or HDP today, there is no harm. You will not see PET or HDP in the litter around the streets of any developing country. They will get picked up and they will get recycled. Maybe not 100% of it, but enough, right? Whereas low value plastics, if you are not funding it, it will not get picked up, period. So plastic credits have the opportunity to allow 100% additionality there. And I think that's where the greatest scope is.
Great. So we've heard this term 100% additionality a few times. We've heard it from Svanika, we've heard it from Sahithi. This goes out to any of you. Can you sort of explain that a little more, expand on that concept, tell us what that means?
Svanika, do you want to take this?
Yeah, I can go for it, and then maybe Sahithi, you can like jump on as well. So when we talk about, I think 100% additionality, it's really about kind of how do we maximize the impact that we are having with this dollar that's coming in, and how do we make sure that it's going to the right place and it's not really funding something that might have like not moved the environmental needle all that much. And so maybe kind of, a couple of examples, like Sahithi mentioned, if you look at the PT or the HDP recovery rate in India, it's about like, over 60% of it does get recovered. In some cases, almost 75% of it gets recovered. And so if we were to go fund kind of that specific recovery and formalize that whole chain, yes, we can say, yes, the whole thing is formalized, but the environmental needle has not really moved that much because that 100 tons of PT that got picked up and recycled in this formal manner would have gotten picked up and recycled anyway. And so in those kinds of cases, what we would be looking at is all these low value materials that don't necessarily get picked up or don't necessarily get funded. So that's kind of like one way that you can create additionality, where we're saying like, every time you go into a new geography. So Waste Ventures India is situated in Hyderabad, and kind of the context of Hyderabad and in a developing context is quite different to say one of the projects that Daniella and Vita Coco are working with, which is in Indonesia through Waste for Change. And we're talking about coastal regions and moving waste between islands. And so the baselines there are completely different. So PT might not be additional in India, but it is additional in maybe like a different type of geography. And so the first thing we really need to be doing is kind of creating that right kind of baseline to understand what is the existing infrastructure, what is the existing recovery rates. And then really 100% additionality is just meaning that every dollar is gone towards creating a delta over that baseline. So you've just established kind of saying that this geography, this region has this rate of recovery, and now all my money has gone into increasing it over here. And that difference is really where your additionality comes in. So it's not, I guess, one example is the subsidization of low value plastic recovery. A different example can be, say, say one of our projects in Kenya was kind of working with infrastructure creation, where Kenya, so in India, PP polypropylene gets recovered and there are like existing recycling facilities for that. So it wouldn't necessarily be that much additional there. But in Kenya, no one, polypropylene didn't even have a recycling facility. So Takataka, our partner there, was able to create the country's first ever PP recycling plant. And therefore, every piece of plastic that goes through that plant then is additional, because without that recycling plant, none of it would have been recovered or recycled anyway. So I guess those are just some like different ways of looking at it. But I think it all just comes down to how are you creating that delta? How are you measuring that baseline? And ensuring that that needle is really moving.
Great, wonderful, thank you. So let's see, we have another question that has come in here from the audience. Maybe this one is most appropriate for Daniella. It says, has anyone done consumer testing on the concept of plastics credits to see how they respond to the idea? Maybe before and after being educated about it. So maybe you can talk from your perspective and your customers.
Yes. I think this is a really interesting question that you ask when it comes to consumer awareness around sustainability and life cycle assessment. It's still very new, a new concept. I'm actually going to answer simultaneously the previous question, which is asking about compostable packaging. So I think what happens is right now in the mainstream and what we're currently seeing from shopping behavior is that people want to feel good about the purchases that they make, and they want to be told what that is, and they don't necessarily want to always do the research on their end. So it's our responsibility as the brand to do that research up front and make sure that we're making the right choices and we're putting the right stuff out there. From a compostable packaging standpoint, I think what's really interesting is most consumers assume that compostable, maybe like a PLA plastic, is better than a PET plastic when they're shopping for, single-use plates or cups, or they're at a coffee shop. They want to see that little green leaf because they want to see that we're making the greener choices. However, we know that there's a lot of misinformation around that, because from a waste management and recovery standpoint, those plastics are harder to recover and to recycle and to put back into the system. So I think, right there itself, education, we have to do better at creating a better foundation for our customers to understand what those differences are. Right now, people don't understand the difference. And right now they just want to hear you're doing the right thing. And there's not enough regulation in the space today to help ensure that brands are making the right choices. And I think that's what's the hope is here with VERA, the plastic credit initiative for the 3 Rs, is to create some sort of standardized practice of accreditation that will help ensure companies are doing the right thing when it comes to neutralizing their plastic waste. And I would say for us, that is definitely part of our process. Before we start communicating publicly on kind of like what this means or what kind of educational tools that we need, we'll do a consumer insight sampling and figure out, okay, what do people want to hear more? Does this message resonate with them? Do they want to be told that what they might not know, like what they think they know is not actually right? Do they want to be told that there's all these other ways about thinking about it? That's kind of the process that is happening. But, we work with partners like rePurpose. We work also with the Carton Council for Tetra and Grade 52, which is a whole other conversation. And to make sure that we're kind of doing the right thing and we're in this together, because we don't think that we're going to be the sole company to solve this issue. It has to be a collection of brands and industries coming together to have better education and better response to the problems that we're seeing and the consumers are questioning about.
Great. You brought up a couple points about, talking about the Grade 52 and the aseptic packaging. From Vita Coco's perspective, what was the impetus to join this plastics crediting system? It seems like you talked about aluminum, water bottles, and the cartons. Is it the laminate plastic portion, or is there a different reason? And even the bigger question, do you have to be a brand that puts plastic out into the environment to partake in the plastics crediting platform?
Totally. I think any brand that has any sort of consumption of plastic should be invited into the plastic crediting platform, whether it's you're a to-go company or you have packaging, single-use packaging on any aspect of your brand. I think it's a really interesting space to start exploring, and rePurpose literally makes it so easy for like the most basic human with the basic knowledge can kind of understand like putting something in and taking something out and what it means. And they make it really easy for brands and for people who don't have a background in sustainability kind of understand how to join the conversation or start like thinking about it in a new framework. So I would just want to call that out. The second piece is a great question. Like as a single-use beverage company, like what is the most sustainable use of packaging? And the answer is we don't have an answer. You know, grade 52 has its plus and minuses. PET plastic has its plus and minuses. Aluminum has its plus and minuses. So it really depends on the content that's going into the packaging. For coconut water, in order to maintain its integrity of the product, and we're single source coconut water, we package at the site to ensure that it stays preserved. We put it in a Tetra Pak because that is what's the best format for packaging the coconut water and to deliver it to consumers and still maintain the integrity of the product. However, we actually started packaging coconut water in PET bottles as well. And that was actually at the request 3 years ago from some of our retailers that were looking for easier, more familiar formats for customers to pick up off the shelf. And we've actually seen our retailers ask us for that packaging format. Now, that's kind of how we started our sustainability journey. Like, you know, we were like, we have Tetra Pak, we have grade 52, like, you know, we know it's not perfect, but like, isn't it better than PET? And that's been the journey that we've been on for the last several years of understanding, okay, now that we have PET, which we also have an aseptic PET to maintain the quality of the product. However, we can't package in aluminum because it will die in an aluminum can, sadly. We felt that, you know, okay, what is our response to PET? Like, it's such a small portion of our business. Like, what are we doing? And then in that process, we've been understanding more and more the impact of grade 52 and all that. But the simple and short answer is there's no silver bullet solution to all of this. It's important for us to do the work on our end to make sure that we're measuring and we're monitoring our waste. And then we're figuring out long-term solutions to be part of the solution and not part of the problem.
Great, wonderful. So I'm gonna ask Ann Johnson a question here, building on what Daniella is saying about, you know, the choices between different packaging substrates, and, you know, from a waste management perspective, can you talk a little bit about the pros and cons there and how people can make selections? And then also building on that, when we're talking about plastics, how do you see the role of the plastics credit system from where you sit?
Well, I actually think Sahithi said it beautifully, and it fills this important gap, you know, from things that really have clear market value to this space where we have a realm of plastics that really have very low to no value. And that's challenged because often they're not sorted. They're mixed with organics. And I think somebody asked this question, they asked about compostable packaging. Would it be helpful if these types of laminates and films were compostable? And I think that's a very complicated question. And I think that the problem is that, you know, though that material, we want to compost organics if possible. The first step is we need to educate people on wet dry separation, because that's going to improve the system for recovering economically viable materials, as well as, you know, participating in this credit system. And that education is challenging. And I mean, none of us are born learning how to manage our waste, and it's something that you get educated on how to do that. And when you're implementing a new system and changes, you have to lead people through that guidance on how to do that. And it sounds like Sahithi is really on the ground working on that day to day. So kudos to you for that. But I think that, you know, I think they fill this really important role, but at the end of the day, it's a mitigation role. And if we don't get to that upstream behavior and those pieces, you know, we're just going to continue to mitigate. We need to ultimately solve the upstream problem about proper management. And I think that we will get there through more awareness and more activity on this, and people making waste management sexy.
Great. Wonderful.
Also,
Thank you.
sorry, if I may interject just my short piece, because I've had just this weekend, 3 people asked me doubts about compostable packaging because my clients keep WhatsApping me saying, you know, we have an event, we don't want to use plastic, what do we do? Just this weekend, there's plant-based plastics. There are something called oxo-biodegradable plastics, all of these in the range of compostable packaging. Now the customers do not know and the brands do not make it clear whether they are compostable at home, whether they're compostable in a commercial facility under STARS, terms and conditions apply to the composting, whether they're compostable in our facility or not. We're planning to test that as well. But I think if brands are going for sustainable compostable packaging, it would be very helpful to be very clear about under which conditions it would compost in. Otherwise, it would just mess up our recovery systems beyond control, because right now there's no way for us to train our waste pickers to differentiate between a plastic cover and the compostable plastic cover. So yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, very good points there. Yeah. All right. So let's see. I think we have this question for Svanika. We have a few minutes left, so I'll ask this question and then we will move into closing remarks. So let's see. You know, building on also on this concept of materials management and plastics credits. So how can the current system of plastics credits be improved, and what's next? Especially, you know, Anne mentioned, you know, mitigation, and, you know, that's, you know, how can we sort of move upstream and move past that? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, definitely. I can maybe like start, and I'm sure like I feel like there's so many improvements that I can think about on an ecosystem level, and then there's so many improvements that I think would help out people like Sahithi and Waste Ventures, and then so many improvements that would help like people like Vita Coco and, you know, Daniella, and when they're trying kind of their piece there. But in terms of a system as a whole, I think as we're setting up, it's just incredibly important for us to be setting up with the kind of the vision of the future, where I think one of the shortfalls perhaps of the carbon credit market was that it very quickly became really fragmented, and it really quickly became kind of, you know, there's so many types of carbon credits. You can plant a tree, you can like get a cook stove going, you can do so many different things, and they're all like to varying degrees effective, and they're all to varying degrees, like the funding, you know, like is it really going towards the impact, or is it kind of being eaten up by like, you know, 5-6 different middlemen who sit in the middle. So I think there was kind of a lot of like structural issues around carbon credit that I think we should be thinking about when we go into the conversation about plastic credits. And it's a great time to be having that conversation because we're sitting at that start line, we're sitting at the beginning. And so really how are we gonna set the context going forward? So the 3RA initiative, like what Vera is doing with the plastic accounting standard, is a great first step for us to really say, okay, only products that are truly deemed additional, that have that kind of additionality capability, are really eligible to create plastic credits. So kind of creating that baseline is the first thing. And then I think going from there, there's a lot to be said in terms of material matching, in terms of geography matching. Like right now we're starting with volumes, right? We're starting with like, okay, you put out 100 tons, you're going to remove 100 tons, which is very simple. But how do we, you know, say you are a plastic packaging company, like say Vita Coco, which has been absolutely brilliant, you know, in coming up with so many different strategies to tackle like, you know, different types of facets of their packaging. Say you're a company that's gone from maybe using polymers to monomers, which is a great step that you've taken because it makes your packaging that much more recyclable. What is a good way to kind of, you know, incentivize that kind of action through plastic credits? Because you're just looking about volumes and there's really no incentive there. 100 tons is still 100 tons. Or how do you get people who are using MLP to move away from that instead of kind of subsidizing the lighter weight materials? So there's a lot of kind of conversation around how do you think about different materials through the lens of plastic credits, like PET versus MLP, and so on. So that's kind of, I think, one piece of it. And the second piece also answers, I think, a couple of questions that we've gotten in the chat box about geography matching, right? About kind of my plastic is being used in the United States. What do I do about it over here? And I think it becomes an even more complicated situation given how the infrastructure is set up right now, where it's just so easy for people, in developed countries, I guess a lot of North Canada, the same, US, Europe, where it's easy to put all our plastic on a ship and then send it halfway across the world to Indonesia or Somalia or India to kind of take care of it. How do we incentivize that to like change a little bit? How do we incentivize kind of infrastructure that like is more localized, so to speak, as well? That's kind of another conversation around it. So I think there's different ways where this can go, but we're at the beginning, and I think it's just an exciting time to be here. Yeah.
I would just also add too, there's like momentum for this from a brand perspective. Like all of us collectively are looking for better answers because consumers are seeing plastic and they're like, oh no, we know plastic is bad. What do we do? And it's like, well, not all plastic is created equal. And like, how do we help share that story, and how do we help create solutions for everybody? That's kind of like where we want to help bridge that gap.
Great. Wonderful. And so we're just about out of time, but I wanted to go around and give each of you about 10 seconds to give one closing remark. Maybe what is the in just a few words, the most important take-home point you want this audience to leave here with today? Starting with Svanika, maybe?
Yeah, for sure. So mine's actually a little bit of a plug. Everybody in the audience out there, please visit plasticneutral.global. Sign up for newsletters if you want to learn more about where plastic credits is going and how you as an individual or you as a business can be involved. To kind of an earlier question, you don't have to be a plastic producing brand. You can be anybody out there who's just interested in ocean plastic as a problem or waste management as a problem to be part of the solution. So do kind of go to plasticneutral.global, or you can email us directly at letstalk@repurpose.global, and we'd love to carry the conversation with you.
Great, wonderful. Sahithi?
So yeah, my take home point would be to please be very mindful of your consumption. Overall, that's the best thing that you can do for the ecosystem from your individual standpoint. Of course, the next thing is to compensate for whatever you're doing. But if you can just be mindful of your consumption and your individual choices, you as a person have a lot of power as a consumer. So I think to wield that power with some thought behind it. Great.
Daniella, let's move to you.
I would say she's still mine. I would say it starts with you. Definitely starts with what you're using. And I think the sooner you start kind of making those choices for yourself, and the more education you can be you can have and you can obtain, the more powerful your voice will be in helping incentivize change internally, whether it's your company, whether it's with your family, whether it's in your city, and also vote. That's an important one too.
Great. And finally, Anne. Anne, you're on mute if you're speaking.
Thank you for reminding me. Somebody asked a question about like, how do we sort of activate this in the US? And I think Svanika was talking about, regionalizing it. And I think that, we have literally thousands and thousands of cleanups in the US and across North America. And I think that this, the plastic credit system gives us a model to think about that differently about our cleanups here. And I put a plug in for Keep America Beautiful, who is doing this kind of work sort of day in and day out. And they're in the process of doing a big litter study. And if you look at some of the pictures of the cleanups along the Mississippi River, there are tons and tons of plastics that come up on the levees and, U.S. beaches and on levees. So this is not, we all have a part to play and a part we can do. And I think Sahithi hit the key, think about your consumption. And most importantly, think about management. All those little bits and pieces you see, take the time to pick them up and make sure they're managed, because we all, model the behavior we want others to take. So I'll leave it at that.
Wonderful, thank you. And so that concludes. Thank you everyone for joining. And we hope you enjoyed the Packaging Sustainability's New Paradigm Perspectives on Plastics Neutrality.